as we go through a portion of God's Word. God bless you. May He continue to rain down upon you, not like this liquid sunshine that we're experiencing here in the tri-state area, but that God's blessings would continue to be a part of your life. I want to, before we get into today's lesson, go back to last week's lesson. And I had somewhat of a senior moment. Those of you who have gone more than 70 can certainly sympathize. I was trying to think of the name of one who came to Jesus by night when I was mentioning how Nehemiah was exploring the damage that had been done to the wall around Jerusalem during the Babylonian conquest and the taking away. And what I realized later on when I thought about it was that I was trying to think of Nicodemus, of course, who was the one who came to Jesus in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel according to John. But because of the similarities between Nicodemus and Nehemiah, I had somewhat of a senior moment and couldn't quite think of it. But those things happen as we age. We just thank God that He gives us opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to try to get things right. Today's lesson is entitled A Plea for Restoration, taken from the Old Testament book of Lamentations, the 5th chapter, the 1st through the 22nd verses. Now, while there are some scholars that don't attribute the authorship of Lamentations to Jeremiah, it's widely accepted that Lamentations is an addendum, if you will, to Jeremiah's book of prophecy. So, what is a lamentation, or what does it mean to lament? To lament actually means to mourn, to be sorrowful. And of course, the book of Lamentations is a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. I made a couple of notes for myself that the book of Lamentations actually tells the people that are in captivity that despite their past sins, God has not completely rejected them. They are being punished for their sins, but that God has not completely rejected them. And of course, because God hasn't completely rejected him, that God will restore Jerusalem and establish a new covenant with his people in the future. And of course, that prophecy was realized some 600 years later when Jesus came to Jerusalem to inaugurate this covenant by being lifted up by the Lord. Amen. So, let us begin the reading of our lesson. We're going to begin with the first verse of the 5th chapter of Lamentations. Remember, O Lord, what is come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach. Our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. We are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Our necks are under persecution. We labor and have no rest. We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. Servants have ruled over us. There is none that doth deliver us out of their hand. We get our bread with the peril of our lives. because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. They ravished the women in Zion and the maids in the cities of Judah. Princes are hanged up by their hand. The faces of elders were not honored. They took the young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood. The elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart is ceased, our dance is turned into mourning. The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned. For this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim. Because of the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. Thou, O Lord, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever and forsake us so long time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. Paints a very dim picture of the state of the people of Judah who have been taken away into captivity. Actually, was done in two different stages. Certainly, you're able to read in the book of Daniel how he was among a lot of the young nobles that were taken away into Babylon and indoctrinated with the ways of the Chaldeans. But Jeremiah, who is sometimes referred to as the weeping prophet, uh, he is expressing how he is feeling as a result of the pronouncement from God of being taken away in captivity because of the sin of the people. Primarily, I should say, because of idolatry. We saw that in our lessons in Nehemiah and in Ezra. That one of the things that displeases God the most is to put something or someone in place of God and not putting God first. God was very clear when he told the nation of Israel when they were receiving the law that was given to Moses, the Ten Commandments. God was very clear about how he felt about not being put first, that he was a jealous God. He needed to be first in their lives, as he ought to be in our lives as well. It was God that woke us up this morning, no one or nothing else. If you think it was your alarm clock or your phone or whatever that woke you up this morning, you are mistaken. It was God that allowed you to hear whatever it was that might have awakened you, but it was God that ensured that you had life for yet another day. So let's begin with the first verse of our lesson. Remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our approach. Now, right away, Jeremiah is pleading with God to remember the things that they have suffered and endured during Jerusalem's fall to the Babylonians. And so he is making an appeal to God to think about what they have been going through and what they have suffered. Now, of course, that word reproach has to do with shame or scorn, disgrace. That's one of the things that Nehemiah happened to have mentioned. One of the reasons why he wanted to have the wall built back up around the city, so that they were no longer a reproach, that they no longer were a shame to those surrounding nations, so that they would be protected and not an easy prey for those around them. And of course, the destruction of the city is only just a part of what was causing shame in the hearts of the Lord's people. Verse 2, our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. Now, of course, when the Babylonians took them away into Babylon, and there was just a small remnant left in Jerusalem, when you leave your home, either on purpose, or if something causes you to not be able to stay in your home, that home in all likelihood is going to fall into the hands of someone else. And of course, they recognized that since they were no longer able to live in their own homes, that people that ordinarily wouldn't have been entitled to live in their homes were now occupying their very homes. Uh, in addition to the individual houses that they might have inhabited, it's more a greater reference to the inheritance of land that God gave them as a result of their being descendants of Abraham. You know, God had made that covenant promise with Abraham and to his seed after, that they would have this land forever. And once they were taken away from the land that had been promised to them, that was just added a feeling of disgrace and sorrow about what had happened to them. Um, Now, of course, it mentions that the Edomites, who had penetrated southern Judah and settled in the south of Hebron, and were later followed by other Edomite and Arab groups. Actually, the loss of the land, which was a concrete sign of the nation's relation to their God, generated a crisis of faith that constitutes the very central theme of the book of Lamentations. Now, while God certainly had pronounced to the nation of Israel that they were to be kind and extend hospitality to strangers, it was more that they would show hospitality and goodwill towards those that were not of the same ethnicity as the Jews, but while they were in their own homes. It certainly didn't mean that they should be happy that people other than the nation of Israel were occupying their very homes since they had been taken away into captivity. We are orphans. Jeremiah continues on. We are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. Verse 4. We have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Now, of course, during the taking of way into Babylon, there was a resistance, obviously, on the part of the nation of Israel. And of course, many men were were killed in the process as they fought against and resisted the taking away of their loved ones into Babylon. And as such, there were a lot of orphans that were left. Children who lost their father to battle. In some cases, they lost their mothers as well. And those mothers who survived certainly, in a lot of cases, lost their husbands. So there was a great amount of distress that the people felt because of this punishment that God had exacted upon the people who he had called unto himself, but needed to be shown the gravity of the sin of idolatry. Now, it mentions, of course, that the resources of the land were no more owned by the remnant, that they didn't even have access to water and firewood. They had to actually pay because they were no longer in control. They couldn't easily get water to irrigate their vegetable gardens and their vineyards, um, and of course they had to pay, in addition to paying for water, they had to pay for firewood so that they could end up cooking their food. Now it says foreigners dictate to the remnants of Judah what to do with their natural resources, since they were no longer in control of the things that would happen to them as they were being occupied, in addition to taking away into Babylon. They had to continue to suffer and were constantly reminded of the horrible situation that they found themselves in. Verse 5 continues on. Jeremiah writes, it says, our necks are under persecution. We labor and have no rest. We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. I don't know how many of you have seen movies where there were ancient battles going on, and those who were the conquerors oftentimes, while their adversary had been felled, or even as the adversary might have been dying, one would put their foot on the neck of the conquered as a further humiliation of the loss, so that they would feel it that much more. Even in some cases, when the battle would be over, the winning king would sometimes put his foot on the neck of the king of the conquered peoples, also as further humiliation that they were to suffer. And it mentions also that they have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Even such that they had to try to make sure that they had enough food to eat. They were willing to bargain with the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were those very same peoples who had conquered the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes to the north, and had subjugated them as well. So even though they weren't a united kingdom anymore, certainly to have to reach out to the hand of peoples who had conquered other part of the nation of Israel, even though they were separated, was further humiliation that they felt. But it was all due to what they had done. It's like they had really no one to blame but themselves, as we're getting ready to get into. Verse 7 reads, "Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities." The punishment of the ancestors' sin was visited upon the children. In the book of Exodus, around the 20th chapter, we could see that the succeeding generations, those that were born during the trek from Egypt toward the Promised Land, they were bearing the consequences of their forefathers' sins, even up to the third or even fourth generations. Now, the covenant that God had made with the people was a corporate covenant. While individuals had to participate, it was with the entire body, the entire nation of Israel as itself. Let's go, if you will, along with me to the 11th chapter of the actual book of Jeremiah. And I want you to follow along with me as I read the first through the 11th verses, and I think you can get a better sense of what's being expressed in terms of how the sins of one generation can follow succeeding generations. Jeremiah 11th chapter. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, "Hear ye the words of this covenant, and speak unto the men of Judah, and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and say thou unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Cursed be the man that obeyeth not the words of this covenant, which I commanded your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace, saying, Obey my voice, and do them according to all which I command you. So shall ye be my people, and I will be your God, that I may perform the oath which I have sworn unto your fathers, to give them a land flowing with milk and honey, as it is this day. Then answered I and said, So be it, O Lord. Then the Lord said unto me, Proclaim all these words to the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, saying, Hear ye the words of this covenant, and do them. For I earnestly protested unto your fathers in the day that I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, even unto this day, rising early and protesting, saying, Obey my voice. Yet they obeyed not, nor inclined their ear, but walked every one in the imagination of their evil heart. Therefore I will bring upon them all the words of this covenant, which I commanded them to do, but they did them not. And the Lord said unto me, A conspiracy is found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They are turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, which refused to hear my words. And they went after other gods, small g, to serve them. The house of Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, and the house of Judah, the 2 tribes to the south, have broken my covenant which I made with their fathers. Verse 11. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, I will bring evil upon them, which they shall not be able to escape. And though they shall cry unto me, I will not hearken unto them. So you see, that paints a picture of what they are now being faced with because of the idolatry and the disobedience from succeeding generations, and such that they never yielded to do that which God commanded them to do. They are in the process of suffering a like fate. When we do wrong, we can expect nothing more than God to punish us. And so we see that although the remnant's ancestors sinned and rightly deserved the judgment, their offspring also did not turn away from the sinful ways of their fathers and therefore fell under judgment. That's what often happens. If you are a parent and you have fallen away from living according to what God says that you ought to do as a parent, and bringing up your child and children in the nurture and admission of the Lord, what do you think is going to happen to them? They are going to suffer the ongoing separation from God, and unless they ultimately hear the voice of God and yield to his call, they are going to suffer the same kind of condemnation that you will experience as well. Okay, let's continue on in the 5th chapter of Lamentations. We're coming close to finishing up. Verse 8. Servants have ruled over us. There is none that doth deliver us out of their hand. We get our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. Now, these servants that are being referred to here are not those who have been subjugated, but the servants that Jeremiah is referring to are minor Babylonian officials whom the king had given leadership over the nation of Israel, the captives people. And sometimes, if in fact you have been subjugated yourself, when you get into a position wherein you can exercise authority over someone else, sometimes you are that much worse because of how you have been treated in the past. We of the African diaspora oftentimes can look back in our history and see that sometimes slaves who had become trustees, if you will, sometimes acted against their former partners in slavery with greater vengeance as than did the majority people who actually owned us. And such was the case here. But he continues on and mentions how that while they were in the process of gathering enough food to cook, that because of the famine that it existed, such that there was no rain, there's a constant shining down of the hot sun, and certainly we know that the more time that we spend in the sun, our skin gets burned, and such that we end up being darker than we had been prior to spending the time in the sun. And so the Israelites felt as though they were, in essence, being cooked in the sun, and that their skin had become blackened as the pots that had been charred from the cooking process. Verse 11. They ravished the women in Zion and the maids in the cities of Judah. Princes are hanged up by their hand. The faces of elders were not honored. They took the young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood. Now, oftentimes during battles, and when one peoples are trying to conquer another, sometimes it's the women that suffer a great amount of humiliation, and that there's oftentimes a lot of rape going on in addition to the actual killing of the soldiers that are fighting. And it mentions how that the princes, the rulers or leaders of Jerusalem that had some sort of civilian authority are being put to death in shameful, torturous kinds of ways. The old men of the city that ordinarily would be receiving, respect and honor, are now despised by the enemies, and the young men are being used to grind wheat into flour that were ordinarily where you had animals that would actually do the not running around, being led around, such that the grinding stone would be grinding the wheat into flour that they could use for baking. And in addition to that, you had children who ordinarily would be spending their time in idle pursuits and having fun as they're growing. Now they are being forced into hard labor. What a horrible situation that they found themselves into because God was punishing them for their sin. The elders, verse 14, have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart is ceased. Our dance is turned into mourning. The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sins. So while Jeremiah is making it known that the people know the reason why they have suffered this great devastation, they are the ones that have disobeyed God and are now reaping the covenant curses, just as they gained the covenant blessings when they properly obeyed God. For this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim, because of the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. So even while they are suffering humiliation, the very places, even where they went to worship their God, You now have unclean animals who were normally in the forest around in the countryside have taken up their place in and around the city. It's almost like in some of our modern cities, oftentimes when you have homes and apartment buildings and the like, what do? You get a tremendous amount of vermin that takes up residence, and they become the ones that are in charge, and it's tough to get rid of them. Uh, Thou, O Lord, verse 19, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever, and forsake us so long time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. Jeremiah is pointing out, of course, that it's God that is the constant here, and that we human beings are not here forever. But they're feeling as though God has forgotten them, when in fact there was a specific amount of time that God was going to punish them. But he says something very pivotal in the 21st verse when he asks that God should turn us unto himself, and we shall be turned. You see, unless God draws us, we are not drawn. We have to be available and have our hearts open to hear the voice of God. But even in this generation where evil seems to be so prevalent, God is unchangeable. It says we can abide by him and be assured that even in misfortune, God alone remains our hope. Jeremiah calls for the restoration of God. He pleads with God to turn their hearts to him once again. He asks God to turn them himself, rather than asking that they be given strength to turn themselves. He realizes, Jeremiah does, that if God does it, then it will happen, because we cannot ourselves turn to God by our will and strength. Verse 22, which finishes our lesson for today. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. God is still very angry with his people, but he has not utterly rejected them forever. It's only for a time. Tough and trying times may come our way, but we should remember that God works everything for our good. All of the things that happen to us, that we suffer through, help us to grow stronger. And if we continue to put our faith in God, that he will bring us through these trying times, then we know that if God says he will do it, he will. Thank you for being with us today. Our lesson for next week comes from the book of 1 Kings, the 22nd chapter, and it's entitled Micaiah Speaking Truth to Power. God bless you. Thank you for being with us. May he watch over you until we meet again. Take care. God bless you.